Imagine being accused of a crime where proving your innocence is impossible. Even worse, imagine that your attempts to defend yourself only serve as additional proof of your guilt. It sounds absurd, like a twisted narrative from a dystopian novel. Yet, this is exactly what happened to thousands of people during one of the darkest periods in European history. And no, I'm not talking about the Middle Ages as many people think. The witch hunts that terrorized Europe for centuries are shrouded in myths and misconceptions that persist to this day. When we think of this period, we immediately picture stakes, crowds of elderly women, fanatical religious tribunals, and accusations of devil worship. But the historical reality is far more complex and in many ways even more terrifying than these simplifications suggest. What few people know is that this phenomenon wasn't just an outbreak of religious hysteria. It was a perfect storm where ancient fears mixed with profound social transformations, economic crises, and dramatic climate changes. It was an era where neighbors denounced neighbors, where a simple argument could end in a fatal accusation, and where a deep-seated fear of the unknown fueled a persecution machine that seemed impossible to stop. The great European witch hunts were not an isolated historical event, but a reflection of how societies unravel under pressure. These trials were, at their core, a desperate attempt to find a singular, tangible cause for a world that had become unpredictable and terrifying. A world where crops failed for no clear reason, where children fell ill to mysterious plagues, and where the very fabric of community was tearing apart. In the absence of a scientific explanation, the supernatural became the only logical answer. In the next few minutes, we'll unravel 6 of the biggest myths about witch hunts. Prepare to discover that much of what you thought you knew about this period is profoundly wrong. And more importantly, we'll understand how these historical misconceptions still affect our worldview today. After all, the mechanisms that led ordinary people to accuse their neighbors of witchcraft aren't so different from those that still fuel persecutions, moral panics, and conspiracy theories today. This isn't just history. It's a chilling lesson in human nature that we would be wise to heed. Myth 1. Only women were accused of witchcraft. When most people think of witch hunts, they picture exclusively female victims. Pop culture, from historical dramas to fantasy novels, has reinforced this image so much that the word witch has become almost synonymous with a persecuted woman. But here's something that might surprise you, a fact that complicates this seemingly simple story. Roughly 1 in every 4 people accused of witchcraft was actually a man. You don't learn this in history classes out there. In fact, in some regions, men made up the majority of those accused. Take Iceland, for example, where an astounding 90% of executed witches were men. In certain parts of Switzerland and Russia, male victims also outnumbered female ones, and in places like Normandy and Estonia, the gender split was nearly equal. These statistics paint a very different picture from what most people imagine. So why do we think of witch hunts as exclusively targeting women? Part of it comes down to simple math. Women did make up the majority of victims in most regions, typically around 75 to 80% of accusations. But there's more to this story than just numbers. The reasons why women faced more accusations reveal something crucial about society during this period. Women, especially those who were elderly, widowed, or living alone, often found themselves at the margins of society. They were more vulnerable to accusations when things went wrong in their communities. A woman who was too independent, too outspoken, or simply too different from social norms could quickly become a target of suspicion. But men weren't immune to these accusations. Male witches were often accused for different reasons. Some were charged with using magic for financial gain, while others were targeted because of their association with accused women. Still others simply fell victim to local grudges or political rivalries. In some cases, entire families were accused, with husbands, wives, and even children facing charges together. Understanding the complex gender dynamics of witch hunts reveals something deeply important. These persecutions weren't simply about misogyny, though that certainly played a major role. They were about power, social control, and the human tendency to blame misfortune on those who seemed different or threatening to the established order, regardless of their gender. They were a tool to enforce conformity in a world that was becoming increasingly unstable. The focus wasn't always on a person's supernatural ability, but on their social standing. The witch hunt was a weapon, and its wielder didn't discriminate based on gender alone. They chose their targets based on perceived weakness and threat. Myth 2. The Catholic Church was the main force behind witch hunts. If you ask most people who was responsible for witch hunts, they'll probably point to the Catholic Church and its Inquisition. It's a compelling narrative. Zealous priests hunting down innocent people in the name of religious purity. There's just one problem. It's largely wrong. Here's a fact that might shock you. Some of the most intense witch hunts occurred in Protestant regions, not Catholic ones. Places like Scotland, northern Germany, and Switzerland, all Protestant at the time, saw some of the most aggressive persecutions, with hundreds of people being executed in single towns. Meanwhile, in southern Europe, where the Catholic Church held more power, witch trials were often less frequent and far less deadly. Even more surprising is the role of the Inquisition itself. The Spanish Inquisition, often portrayed as the epitome of religious fanaticism, was actually one of the first institutions to express skepticism about witch accusations. They required solid evidence, questioned the reliability of confessions obtained through torture, and often acted as a moderating force. By 1526, Spanish inquisitors were already warning against false accusations and mass hysteria, urging a more measured and rational approach. You don't learn this in history classes out there. So who was actually behind these persecutions? More often than not, it was secular courts and local authorities. In fact, some of the most brutal witch hunts happened when local communities took matters into their own hands, operating outside of any church authority. Village councils, local magistrates, and even angry mobs were frequently the driving forces behind witch accusations and executions. This doesn't mean the church was innocent. Both Catholic and Protestant religious authorities contributed to the intellectual framework that made witch hunts possible. They published treatises about witchcraft, supported the idea that witches were real, and sometimes actively participated in trials. But the image of the church as the primary instigator of witch hunts is simply incorrect. The reality is far more complex and in many ways more disturbing. Witch hunts weren't just about religious fanaticism. They were about power, control, and community dynamics. They flourished in areas where central authority was weak and local courts had free rein. They thrived in times of social upheaval when people were looking for scapegoats to blame for their problems. Understanding this helps us see witch hunts for what they really were. Not just a religious phenomenon, but a complex social movement driven by a perfect storm of political instability, social anxiety, and local power struggles. Myth 3. Witches were just wise women and healers unfairly persecuted. There's a popular narrative that paints accused witches as misunderstood healers and herbalists. Wise women who preserved ancient knowledge and were persecuted for their skills. It's a compelling story that has gained considerable traction in recent decades, particularly in pop culture and certain historical interpretations. But like many appealing historical narratives, it's more fiction than fact. When we look at actual witch trial records, a very different and far more mundane picture emerges. The majority of accused witches weren't healers or herbalists at all. They were ordinary people, farmers, craftsmen, merchants, and their families. Many had no special knowledge of medicine or herbs. Some were even local officials or clergy members. The real patterns behind these accusations were far more common and, in many ways, more tragic. Most witch accusations stemmed from everyday conflicts and personal vendettas. A quarrel between neighbors over property lines could escalate into a witchcraft accusation. A mysterious illness in livestock might lead to suspicions about a recent visitor. Even basic human emotions like envy, revenge, and fear drove many accusations. Consider the classic case of Katharina Kepler, mother of the famous astronomer Johannes Kepler. She wasn't accused of witchcraft because she was a healer. She was accused because she had a long-running dispute with a neighbor over an unpaid loan. The neighbor's child became ill, and suddenly Katharina found herself facing witchcraft charges. This pattern of personal disputes turning into witch accusations was remarkably common. The modern myth of the wise woman healer emerged largely in the 1970s and gained popularity with the rising interest in alternative medicine and feminist history. While it's true that some accused witches did practice healing, they were a minority. Moreover, most traditional healers in early modern Europe were never accused of witchcraft at all. Many were respected members of their communities who continued practicing throughout the witch hunt period without any problems. What makes this myth particularly problematic is that it obscures the real horror of witch hunts. These persecutions weren't about suppressing ancient wisdom or alternative medicine. They were about how ordinary people, living in a world they couldn't fully understand or control, turned on their neighbors in times of stress and uncertainty. The victims weren't mysterious outsiders with secret knowledge. They were regular people caught in a web of social tensions, fears, and power struggles. This reality is far more relevant to our modern world than the romantic myth of persecuted healers, as it shows how easily communities can turn against their own members when fear and suspicion take hold. Myth 4. Witch hunts were a medieval phenomenon. When people think of witch hunts, they typically imagine them happening in the Dark Ages, that supposedly backward and superstitious medieval period. But here's the shocking truth. The vast majority of witch trials and executions occurred during the Renaissance and early modern period, between 1450 and 1750. Let that sink in for a moment. The most intense, widespread witch hunts happened during the same era as Leonardo da Vinci, Galileo, and Newton. They occurred alongside the scientific revolution, the invention of the printing press, and the discovery of the New World. These weren't persecutions born from medieval darkness. They were, paradoxically, a product of early modern progress. In fact, during the actual Middle Ages, the Catholic Church was largely skeptical about witchcraft accusations. The official church position, established by the canon Episcopi in the 10th century, was that belief in witchcraft was itself a heresy, a pagan superstition. It wasn't until the 15th century, with the publication of new papal decrees and the infamous witch-hunting manual Malleus Maleficarum, that this position began to change dramatically. So what sparked this change? The answer lies in the massive social upheavals of the early modern period. The Protestant Reformation shattered the religious unity of Europe, creating a climate of fear, distrust, and ideological warfare. The invention of the printing press allowed witch-hunting manuals and paranoid theories to spread like wildfire, standardizing the brutal methods used to find and prosecute witches across vast distances. New state bureaucracies and legal systems made systematic persecutions more feasible, turning what was once a local affair into a horrifyingly efficient state-sponsored terror. Even the Little Ice Age, a period of climate cooling, contributed by causing crop failures that people desperately blamed on supernatural sabotage. This timing matters because it fundamentally challenges our assumptions about progress and rationality. The witch hunts weren't the product of medieval superstition being cleared away by enlightened thinking. Instead, they were partly enabled by new technologies, new forms of government, and new ways of thinking. The tools of modernity were turned to terrifying purposes. Understanding this correct timeline helps us see witch hunts in a new, more chilling light. They weren't the last gasp of the Dark Ages, but rather a distinctly modern phenomenon, one that emerged alongside many of the foundations of our own society. This should give us pause. It reminds us that progress doesn't always protect us from our worst instincts. Sometimes it just gives us new, more powerful tools to act on old fears. Myth 5. Witch accusations were always about magic. When we think of witch trials, we imagine dramatic confessions of supernatural powers, pacts with the devil, and magical sabotage. But here's something surprising. Many witch trials had little to do with magic at all. Court records reveal that many accusations were remarkably mundane. A cow stops giving milk, and its owner blames the neighbor they argued with last week. A child falls ill after a beggar was denied food at the family's door. A merchant's business fails, and he accuses a competitor of cursing him. Mundane misfortunes, not spectacular acts of sorcery, formed the backbone of many witch trials. In fact, the evidence presented in court often focused more on the accused's reputation and social behavior than on any supposed magical abilities. Did they argue with their neighbors? Were they disrespectful to local authorities? Did they fail to attend church regularly? Such social transgressions often carried more weight than claims of supernatural misconduct. Consider the case of Agnes Waterhouse, executed in England in 1566. While her trial included tales of a demonic cat, much of the testimony against her focused on her difficult personality and conflicts with neighbors. The magic was almost an afterthought, a way to explain why people disliked her rather than the core of the accusation. This reveals something crucial about witch hunts. They were primarily tools of social control. The threat of accusation helped enforce community norms and proper behavior. The witch label was often attached after someone had already been identified as a troublemaker or social outsider. The supernatural elements were added to justify what was essentially a form of community punishment. Understanding this helps explain why witch hunts were so effective at spreading terror. You didn't need to practice magic to be accused. You just needed to upset the wrong person or violate social norms. In a way, this reality is far scarier than any tales of supernatural evil. Myth 6. Religious fanaticism was the only cause of witch hunts. While religion certainly played a role, the real causes were far more complex and, surprisingly, much more familiar to our modern world. During the peak of witch hunts, Europe was experiencing what we might call a perfect storm of crises. The Little Ice Age brought crop failures and widespread food shortages. The Protestant Reformation had shattered the unity of Christian Europe, sowing deep-seated mistrust. New diseases were spreading through trade routes, and economic inequality was on the rise in many regions. Sound familiar? These weren't just background events. They were key drivers of these persecutions. Take the case of Würzburg, Germany, in the 1620s. This witch hunt, one of the largest in history, coincided with massive crop failures, a devastating economic depression, and the early years of the 30 Years' War. When life became unbearable, people looked for someone to blame. Recent research has even shown a strong correlation between witch trials and extreme weather events. During the coldest periods of the Little Ice Age, witch accusations spiked. When crops failed due to unseasonable frost or storms, communities often blamed these disasters on supernatural sabotage. So it wasn't just religious belief driving these accusations. It was hunger, fear, and desperation. Political instability also played a crucial role. Regions with weak central authority and competing power structures saw more witch trials than areas with strong, centralized governments. Local officials often used witch hunts to demonstrate their power and effectiveness at solving community problems. This broader understanding of the witch hunt's causes makes them more relevant to our own time, not less. When we face multiple crises, environmental, economic, political, people still look for scapegoats. The mechanisms that turned neighbors against each other during witch hunts aren't so different from those that fuel modern conspiracy theories and moral panics. So we have dismantled 6 major myths about witch hunts, revealing a history far more complex and relevant than most people realize. These weren't just medieval superstitions, but sophisticated persecutions that emerged alongside modern institutions. They weren't solely about women, religion, or magic, but about how communities respond to fear and uncertainty. The true power of this history lies in its mirror to our present. Today, we still see how crises, whether environmental, economic, or social, can drive communities to seek scapegoats. The mechanisms that turned neighbors against witches aren't so different from those that fuel modern conspiracy theories and digital witch hunts on social media. We've replaced zealous clergymen with algorithms and village gossip with viral misinformation. But the fear and suspicion remain unchanged. But there is hope in this history too. Some communities resisted the witch-hunting fever, showing that mass hysteria isn't inevitable. Their resistance reminds us that while human nature may not have changed much in 400 years, neither has our capacity to stand against persecution when we recognize its patterns. This is the most important lesson. History is not just a collection of past events. It is a living lesson about who we are and about the choices we can make when faced with great challenges.